Act 3 follows the book of Fidel Villarroel very closely. Father Villarroel is a Dominican, one of the more renowned historians in the Philippines. And he was, if I remember right, the person behind the documents which were presented for the beatification of Lorenzo Ruiz. So if anybody knew Lorenzo Ruiz, it would be Father Villarroel. And well, in that book of his, he points out that there was a moment in which Lorenzo Ruiz wavered. No? He asked one of the Japanese interrogators if they would let him go if he renounced the faith. And the Japanese interrogator answered, well, you'll have to ask the judge that yourself. Now, at that moment, the Japanese interrogator was called out by the judge. No? And on his own initiative, he asked the judge, would you let this man go in case he recants? No? And the judge said, yes, why not? But when he went back to Lorenzo Ruiz met him and told him, look, forget what I asked you earlier. I'm not going to renounce the faith no matter what. Now, Villarroel speculates what happened so that Lorenzo Ruiz experienced that change of mind. And he suspects that in that interval, the head of the mission, who was a friar by the name of Antonio Gonzalez, was brought into the room where Lorenzo Ruiz was. And when he was brought into the room, he had already been tortured. No? So this would have been obvious in the way the friar looked. And then the friar was asked to step on religious objects in front of Lorenzo Ruiz. And he was adamant about not doing that. He was beaten up and tortured further, you know, because of this. And so Villarroel thinks that it was the sight of that man and his example which, in quotation marks, converted Lorenzo Ruiz. No? So Lorenzo never found out that in fact the judge was ready to let him go in case he recanted. Now, the reason why we know these details is because all of these everything we know about the trial of Lorenzo Ruiz came from that Japanese interrogator precisely, who was so moved by the comportment of the 5 missionaries plus Lorenzo Ruiz that after they were martyred, he wrote a report on his own initiative and secretly, and gave this to the Portuguese, who smuggled it out of Japan and brought it to Macau. When it arrived in Macau, there happened to be a Spanish Dominican there who either got a copy or got the copy and brought it to Manila. So by November of that year, they knew about the martyrdom. Otherwise, they had no news at all about what happened to that group. It was a mysterious disappearance. No? So that's one thing that you will see in Act 3. Another thing that you will see in Act 3 is that the Japanese layman, who was a leper, who was with a group, no, at first recanted and then took back his recantation. And Villarroel speculates, it's a very plausible explanation, that his case was similar to Lorenzo Ruiz's. No? That he recanted his recantation after everybody in the group had steadfastly embraced martyrdom. No? I mean, not that they were martyred, no? But they were ready to be martyred. And Villarroel remarks that probably among the examples which he saw, probably the example of Lorenzo Ruiz had a special power because Lorenzo was the only lay person there. And whereas you would expect the friars to be ready for martyrdom, this was something that you would not expect from a layman who had just strayed into the group, no? And did not have the training that the friars had. So in his little book, he says that he thinks that Lorenzo Ruiz might have played a special part in the return to the faith of this particular person, and that's how we present it in Act 3. And I should say, in all justice, that the first version of Act 3 was done by Joe M. Antonio. He wrote the first version of that in all its detail. It's the most detailed act, and the role that that Chris Valles, aka Juan X, had in the writing was to put the lines of dialogue that he wrote into the verse form that we see it now in.